Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome back to the daily readings of Srila Prabhupada's books. Today I went to the Social Security Administration office to apply for my Social Security card. And the girl that I finally got to the person. And she says, "Oh, well, you haven't been in this office since 1964. I said, "That's right. How did you know?" I said, "It's all in the records." And he said, "You got no problem. But you had to come in here," because I was going back and forth of whether to just do it online and send the documents, because you have to send some proof of your citizenship, means passport or like that. So I was thinking, I don't know if I want to send my passport through the mail. So I decided to go down. So it turns out, because I hadn't been there for so long, she was amazed. She said, "You've been without your Social Security." I said, "Well, I don't remember. I know the number, and usually people just ask the number, for bank account or this or that or whatever." He said, "Yeah, well, you good you came, because you haven't been there for so long, you couldn't have done it online." Gee, Hare Krishna. Are we lucky or what that we're in the spiritual world? Krishna and his devotees. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Okay, anyways, this is even more my favorite time of the day, every single day when we do this together. It's the refreshment of all refreshments, the ambrosia of Shabda Brahma going into the heart and giving us real knowledge and real happiness. And we have to get this out to people, because they're suffering like anything, actually, more and more. Okay, Sanatana Goswami's glorification of the Srimad-Bhagavatam. We say it every day. It goes like this. Sarva Shastra Vipiyusha Sarva Vedaika Satpala Sarva Siddhanta Ratnaya Sarva Lokaika Drikprada. O nectar from the ocean of all scriptures, singular fruit of all the Vedas, rich mine of the precious gems of all conclusive truths, you are only the giver of sight to all the worlds. Sarva Bhagavata Prana Srimad Bhagavata Prabho Kalidvanda Ditya Shri Krishna Parivartita. O life air of all the Supreme Lord's devotees, O Master Srimad-Bhagavatam, you are the sun risen in the darkness of Kali. You are the exact image of Sri Krishna. Paramananda Padaya Prema Varshaksharayate Sarvada Sarvasevyaya Shri Krishnaya Namostume. I bow down to you, who are supremely blissful to read. Your every syllable pours down a flood of prema. You can always be served by everyone. You are Sri Krishna himself. Madeka Bando Matsangin Madguro Man Mahadana Mandistaraka Madbhagya Mad Ananda Namostute. My only friend, my constant companion, my spiritual master, my great wealth, my savior, my good fortune, my source of ecstasy, I bow down to you. Asadhu sadhukadayin atini chochatakada hanamunchakada chinmam premna ritkantayoskura. O bestower of saintliness to the unsaintly, O exalter of the most fallen, please never leave me. Always appear in my heart and my voice with pure love. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Okay, we reached the 10th chapter of the 11th canto. Verse number 4. Nature of the nature of fruitive activity. One who has fixed me within his mind as the goal of life. So now Krishna is continuing to instruct Uddhava after he gave him this story about the Avadhuta Brahman. One who has fixed me within his mind as the goal of life should give up activities based on sense gratification and should instead execute work governed by the regulator principles for advancement. When, however, one is fully engaged in searching out the ultimate truth of the soul, one should not accept the scriptural injunctions governing fruitive activities. Purport. Srila Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur explains that the words Jagyasaya Sambhavita refer to one who is yoga arudha, or advanced in the yoga process. In the Bhagavad Gita 6:3 and 4, it is stated, Arudukshor muner yogam karma karana mujjate yoga ruda sitasyaiva shamak karana mujjate yada hinendriyarteshu na karma sanusajjate sarva sankalpa sannyasi yoga rudas tadocchate. For one who is a neophyte in the Eightfold Yoga system, work is said to be the means. And for one who has already attained to yoga, cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. A person is said to have attained to yoga, when, having renounced all material desires, he neither acts for sense gratification nor engages in fruitive activities. The example may be given that an ordinary man will try to enjoy the company of women for material sense pleasure. This is called pravrita karma, or the path of sense gratification. A religious person will also enjoy the company of a woman, but under the regulative principles of the varnashram system. However, one who is fully absorbed in spiritual advancement will ultimately give up all sense gratification derived from sexual association, either regulated or illicit. Similarly, in the stage of pravrita karma, or ordinary sense gratification, one will eat whatever pleases his tongue. On the other hand, a materialistic devotee will sometimes cook sumptuous preparations and offer them to the deity, not in order to satisfy the Lord, but rather with the intention of satisfying his own tongue and belly. However, one who is sampravrita, or fully engaged in spiritual consciousness, is never interested in simply gratifying his tongue. He avoids ordinary foods prepared by materialistic persons, and just for the purpose of keeping his body fit for serving Krishna, he eats moderate quantities of food that has first been offered to the deity for the deity's pleasure. The process of spiritual realization gradually brings a conditioned soul from the lowest point of materialistic consciousness to total absorption in loving service to the personality of Godhead. In the beginning, one is taught to dovetail one's enjoying propensities by first offering to the Lord the fruit of one's work. In the advanced stage, however, the impulse to execute fruitive activities, karma chodhanam, is absent, and one simply engages in the loving service of the Lord without any selfish motive. For example, a sannyasi preaching Krishna consciousness, or even a renounced householder preaching Krishna consciousness, is not required to execute all the injunctions governing sense gratification in family life. Ultimately, every human being should take to the transcendental duties of Krishna consciousness, rather than working to fulfill one's own desires and then offering the results to Krishna. One should fully engage in pleasing the Lord directly according to his own intimate desires. According to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, any attempt to enjoy the material world, either religiously or irreligiously, ultimately will be full of contradictions. One should come to the platform of desirelessness, pure love of Godhead, and thus solve all the problems of life. Text 5. One who has accepted me as the supreme goal of life should strictly observe the scriptural injunctions forbidding sinful activities, and as far as possible should execute the injunctions prescribing minor regulative principles such as cleanliness. Ultimately, however, one should approach a bona fide spiritual master who is full in knowledge of me as I am, who is peaceful, and who by spiritual elevation is not different from me. Purport. The word yaman refers to major regulative injunctions necessary for preserving one's purity. In the Krishna consciousness movement, all bona fide members must give up eating meat, fish, and eggs, and they must also avoid intoxication, gambling, and illicit sex. The word abhikshnam indicates that one cannot at any time perform such forbidden activities, even in difficult circumstances, with the exception of being permitted to eat meat if one will otherwise starve. The word niyaman refers to less obligatory injunctions, such as bathing 3 times daily. In certain difficult situations, one may not bathe 3 times daily, yet may still maintain one's spiritual position. But if one engages in sinful, forbidden activities, even in difficult circumstances, except as noted above, there undoubtedly will be a spiritual fall down. Ultimately, as explained in Upadeshamrita, mere adherence to rules and regulations cannot give one spiritual perfection. One must approach a bona fide spiritual master who is mad abhigyan, or in full knowledge of the personal form of Godhead. The word mat, me, negates the possibility of a bona fide spiritual master having an impersonal conception of the absolute truth. Furthermore, the Guru must be in complete control of his senses. Therefore, he is called Shanta, or peaceful, because of being completely surrendered to the mission of the Lord. Such a spiritual master is Mad Atmakam, or non-different from the personality of Godhead. Text 6. The servant or disciple of the spiritual master should be free from false prestige, never considering himself to be the doer. He should feel enmity toward no one, should be active and never lazy, and should give up all sense of proprietorship over the objects of the senses, including his wife, children, home, and society. He should be endowed with feelings of loving friendship toward the spiritual master, and should never become deviated or bewildered. The servant or disciple should always desire advancement in spiritual understanding, should not envy anyone, and should always avoid useless conversation. Purport. No one can claim to be the permanent proprietor of his so-called wife, family, home, society, and so on. Such material relationships appear and disappear like bubbles on the surface of the ocean. No one can claim to be the creator of the material elements that produced one's home, society, and family. If it were a fact that parents were the ultimate creators of the bodies of their children, children would never die before their parents. The parents would simply create new bodies for the children. Similarly, parents would also not die because they would create new bodies for themselves to replace the old ones. Actually, God creates everyone's bodies as well as the material elements with which we build our material societies. Therefore, before death drags these things out of our grasp, we should voluntarily engage them in the loving service of the spiritual master, who is the bona fide representative of Lord Krishna. Then such material objects, instead of causing lamentation, will be the cause of happiness. Text 7. One should see one's real self-interest in life in all circumstances, and should therefore remain detached from wife, children, home, land, relatives, friends, wealth, and so on. Purport. A devotee of the Lord recognizes that his wife, children, home, land, friends. Johnny on the spot. Oh, slow on the switch. A devotee of the Lord recognizes that his wife, children, home, land, friends, and money are meant to be engaged in the loving service of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, he does not frantically make arrangements for the sense gratification of his family and friends. He is not eager to enjoy the false prestige of being the master of his wife and the lord of his children, nor is he anxious to gain prestige from his friends and society. Thus, he does not envy anyone, and he is not lazy in the matter of self-realization. He is free from the false sense of proprietorship and is always eager to develop his understanding of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is free from false egotism and automatically turns away from useless, materialistic conversation. Thus he is steady and not whimsical, and he is always firmly situated in loving friendship at the lotus feet of the spiritual master. The question may be raised as to how one can develop freedom from false proprietorship. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has given the following example. An ordinary man is very eager to accumulate more and more money, and he maintains his wealth in the form of bank accounts, properties, gold, and so on. As long as these different assets are contributing to his financial well-being, he sees them equally and considers that they belong to him. But if some of his assets are taken by the government for taxes, or if they are lost in an unfortunate business agreement, then he is forced to give up his sense of proprietorship. In the same way, everyone should be intelligent enough to observe that one's sense of ownership over innumerable material objects is not permanent. Therefore, one should develop detachment from these things. If one does not cultivate a loving feeling of friendship for the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his pure devotee, the spiritual master, one will undoubtedly be entangled by the network of material society, friendship, and love. One will then remain bound up on the material platform with no hope of permanent happiness. Text 8. Just as fire, which burns and illuminates, is different from firewood, which is to be burned to give illumination, similarly, the seer within the body, the self-enlightened spirit soul, is different from the material body, which is to be illuminated by consciousness. Thus, the spirit soul and the body possess different characteristics and are separate entities. Purport. It is analytically demonstrated in this verse that one should never falsely identify the ego with the material body. Such misidentification is called false ego, or material illusion. The following question may be raised. Since it is commonly known that the Supreme Personality of Godhead enlightens the conditioned soul, why is the term swadrik, or self-enlightened, used in this verse? Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that although the Supreme Personality of Godhead certainly furnishes consciousness to the living entity, the living entity, being endowed with the potency of the Lord, has himself the capacity to revive and expand his pure consciousness. He may therefore be considered in a secondary sense self-enlightened. The example may be given that gold or silver domes brilliantly reflect the rays of the sun. Although the light comes from the sun, the inherent properties of gold and silver can also be considered causes for the brilliant reflection. What a nice analogy, huh? Since other substances do not possess suitable properties to reflect the sun's light. Similarly, the spirit soul can be considered swadrik, or self-enlightened, because he possesses characteristics by which he can brilliantly reflect the potency of the personality of Godhead, thus illuminating his existential situation, just as a gold or silver dome shines due to its reflective properties. A nice example is given in this verse to illustrate the different characteristics of the body and soul. Fire, which burns and illuminates, is always different from that which is burned for illumination. It may be said, however, that fire is present in an unmanifest form within wood. Similarly, in the conditioned life of ignorance, the spirit soul is present, though unmanifest, within the body. The enlightened condition of the living entity can be compared to the act of arousing fire within wood. Just as fire quickly burns wood to ashes, similarly, the spirit soul, when enlightened, burns to ashes the darkness of ignorance. We are conscious of the body. Therefore, it may be said that the body is illuminated by consciousness, which is the energy or symptom of the spirit soul. Identifying the body and soul as one is just as foolish as considering fire and wood to be the same. In both cases, the intimate circumstantial connection between fire and wood, or between the soul and the body, does not alter the fact that fire is different from wood, or that the soul is always different from the body. Text 9. Just as fire may appear differently as dormant, manifest, weak, brilliant, and so on, according to the condition of the fuel, similarly the spirit soul enters a material body and accepts particular bodily characteristics. Purport. Although fire may appear and disappear with any particular object, the element fire always exists. Similarly, the eternal soul appears within a suitable body and then disappears from that body, but the soul always exists. Just as fire is different from its fuel, the soul is different from the body. A match makes a tiny fire, whereas the explosion of a huge gasoline truck will send flames shooting up into the sky. But still, fire is one. Similarly, one spirit soul may appear in the body of Brahma and another in the body of an ant. But the spirit soul is qualitatively the same in every body. Because of ignorance, we impose the bodily characteristics upon the soul, and thus we say that a particular person is American, Russian, Chinese, African, or Mexican, or that he is old or young. Although such designations certainly apply to the body, they do not apply to the spirit soul, which is described here as parak, or a transcendental entity. As long as the bewildered spirit soul remains inimical to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the designations of the gross and subtle bodies will wrap themselves around him, keeping him in darkness. If one intellectually identifies himself with various materialistic philosophies of life, he becomes covered by the subtle mind. Ultimately, everything that exists is part and parcel of the Absolute Truth, Lord Krishna. When the living entity realizes this, he becomes nirupadi, or free from material designations. This is his constitutional position. Text 10. The subtle and gross material bodies are created by the material modes of nature, which expand from the potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Material existence occurs when the living entity falsely accepts the qualities of the gross and subtle bodies as being his own factual nature. This illusory state, however, can be destroyed by real knowledge. Purport. Regarding the analogy comparing fire and its fuel to the soul and the body, one may argue that to some extent fire is dependent upon its fuel and cannot exist without it. Since we do not experience the existence of fire independent of fuel, one may therefore still question how it is possible for the living entity to exist separately from the body, become covered by it, and eventually become free from it. Only through the Supreme Personality of Godhead's knowledge, potency, vidya, can one clearly understand the nature of the living entity. By vidya, or real knowledge, one may cut material existence to pieces, and even in this lifetime experience spiritual reality. According to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, our material existence is an artificial imposition by the Lord's inconceivable potency of nations. The qualities of gross and subtle material forms are psychologically imposed upon the living being, and because of misidentification with the body, the living entity initiates a series of illusory activities. As explained in the previous chapter, the present material body is like a tree that produces the karmic seed of the next body. However, this cycle of ignorance can be cut to pieces by the transcendental knowledge explained by the Lord. Unfortunately, the conditioned souls, being inimical to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, do not accept the perfect knowledge spoken by the Lord. Instead, they remain absorbed in gross and subtle illusion. But if the living entity accepts the Lord's knowledge, his whole situation can be rectified, and he can return to his original, eternal, blissful life of perfect knowledge in the direct association of the Lord. Text 11. Therefore, by the cultivation of knowledge, one should approach the Supreme Personality of Godhead situated within oneself. By understanding the Lord's pure, transcendental existence, one should gradually give up the false vision of the material world as independent reality. Purport. The word yatha kramam, step by step, means that after first realizing oneself to be different from the gross material body, one should then progressively detach oneself from material mental activities. In this verse, etad vastu buddhim means seeing the material world as existing independently rather than correctly seeing all things as emanations of the Absolute Truth. When one correctly identifies oneself as eternal spiritual form, one achieves the real fruit of knowledge. The Lord is eternally manifest in his eternal form, and the living entity is similarly manifest in his eternal form as the loving servitor of the Lord. When we falsely assume that temporary, illusory, material objects are real, knowledge of our eternal spiritual form is covered by ignorance. If, however, one meditates upon the Lord's supreme presence within everything, one can return to the normal, blissful state of spiritual life. Every human being should seriously endeavor to understand the Absolute Truth, as indicated in this verse by the word jigyasaya. Text 12. The spiritual master can be compared to the lower kindling stick, the disciple to the upper kindling stick, and the instruction given by the Guru to the third stick, placed in between. Sorry, that was me. The transcendental knowledge communicated from Guru to disciple is compared to the fire arising from the contact of these, which burns the darkness of ignorance to ashes. bringing great happiness to both guru and disciple. Purport. When the darkness of ignorance is burned to ashes, the dangerous life of ignorance is also eradicated, and one can work for his true self-interest in full knowledge. In this verse, the word adya means original, and it indicates the spiritual master, who is compared to the sacred kindling stick held below. From the spiritual master, transcendental knowledge, like fire, is spread to the disciple. Just as friction between two sticks of firewood produces fire, similarly, bona fide contact between the spiritual master, who is the representative of Krishna, and a sincere disciple produces the fire of knowledge. When the disciple takes shelter of the lotus feet of the spiritual master, he automatically acquires perfect knowledge of his original spiritual form. Text 13. By submissively hearing from an expert spiritual master, the expert disciple develops pure knowledge, which repels the onslaught of material illusion arising from the three modes of material nature. Finally, this pure knowledge itself ceases, just as fire ceases when the stock of fuel has been consumed. Purport. The Sanskrit word Vaisharadi means that which is derived from the expert, Visharada. Perfect transcendental knowledge comes from the expert spiritual master, and when such knowledge is heard by the expert disciple, it curbs the waves of material illusion. Since the Lord's illusory energy acts eternally within the material world, there is no possibility of destroying illusion. One may, however, destroy the presence of illusion within one's heart, within one's own heart. To accomplish this, the disciple must become expert in pleasing the expert spiritual master. As one advances to the perfectional stage of Krishna consciousness, experiencing the presence of the Lord everywhere, one's attention shifts to the transcendental platform. At that time, pure knowledge itself, one's constant technical awareness of illusion, diminishes, just as fire diminishes and is extinguished after consuming its stock of fuel. Srila Madhvacharya has quoted from several Vedic scriptures to show that Maya, or material illusion, is just like a witch who always haunts the conditioned souls. Maya offers the conditioned souls whatever they like within the material modes of nature, but such offerings are all just like fire that burns the heart to ashes. Therefore, one must understand that the material world is a hellish place, offering a permanent situation to no one. Externally, we experience many things, and internally, we contemplate our experience, formulating plans for future action. Thus, internally and externally, we are victims of ignorance. Real knowledge comes from the Vedas, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in his form of perfect wisdom. If we become fully Krishna conscious, taking complete shelter of the Lord, then there will be no scarcity of pleasure, because the Lord is the reservoir of all pleasure, and his devotees freely move within that reservoir. Shall I read that again?
Yes.
I mean, that's so nice. This is so nice. If we become fully Krishna conscious, taking complete shelter of the Lord, there will be no scarcity of pleasure, because the Lord is the reservoir of all pleasure, and his devotees freely move within that reservoir. Oh, man. That's the Srimad-Bhagavatam. Text 14 to 16. My dear Uddhava, I have thus explained to you perfect knowledge. There are philosophers, however, who challenge my conclusion. They state that the natural position of the living entity is to engage in fruitive activities, and they see him as the enjoyer of the happiness and unhappiness that accrue from his own work. According to this materialistic philosophy, the world, time, the revealed scriptures, and the self are all variegated and eternal, is existing as a perpetual flow of transformations. That's Buddhism. And physicists think like, knowledge, moreover, cannot be one or eternal because it arises from the different and changing forms of objects. Thus, knowledge itself is always subject to change. Even if you accept such a philosophy, my dear Uddhava, there will still be perpetual birth, death, old age, and disease, since all living entities must accept a material body, subject to the influence of time. My mind keeps flashing on this idea that how important is the basic philosophy of Krishna consciousness. Here's Krishna talking to Uddhava, an eternal associate of Krishna. Krishna is just about to leave, and Uddhava is begging him to take him with him. And he says, no, you have to stay here. I have a mission for you. And then Uddhava is asking him for knowledge. And this is the first, and he says it so thoroughly. So how important is it? And how difficult it must be to overcome, to become fully Krishna conscious. In this verse, according to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Lord Krishna speaks the following to Uddhava. My dear Uddhava, I have clearly established the actual goal of life in the instructions I have just imparted to you. There are those, however, who challenge my conclusion, especially the followers of Jaimini Kavi. If you are favorable to their understanding, and thus do not accept my instructions, then kindly hear the following explanation. According to the followers of Jaimini, the living entity is originally and naturally a performer of fruitive activities, and his happiness and distress are derived from the fruits of his own work. The world in which the living entities find their enjoyment, the time during which they enjoy, the revealed scriptures that explain the means for achieving enjoyment, and the subtle bodies through which the living entities experience enjoyment all exist not only in manifold variety, but also eternally. I know it's hard to understand because this is the Purva-paksha. This is called Purva-paksha. This section is being organized in terms of Purva-paksha, the falsity, and then the explanation of why it's false. So if you don't have discrimination and you hear the Purva-paksha, then you'll get confused thinking it's explaining something that's not true. And it'll be difficult to understand because it's not true. To a devotee, it'll be difficult to understand. But this is important, that we learn the art of negating the Purva-paksha of material existence. Because we'll have to do this ourselves. I've said this many times over the last few weeks. We'll have to do this ourselves. We may not have somebody right around us, or maybe even a book handy sometimes. When the mind takes charge of us, or we meet somebody, that's really expert at Purva-paksha Mayavad philosophy, we can become confused. So that's why we have to know this philosophy and be able to preach to ourselves the truth. The living entity need not develop detachment from material sense gratification, either by seeing the temporariness of individual material objects and situations, or by seeing the material world as an illusory creation, Maya. According to such materialistic philosophy, material objects such as garlands, sandalwood, or beautiful women are temporary in specific manifestations, but perpetually exist through the natural flow of creation and destruction. In other words, although a particular woman's form is temporary, there will eternally be beautiful women within the material world. Thus, by carefully executing fruitive rituals according to religious scriptures, one can maintain enjoyable contact with women and wealth life after life. In this way, one's sense gratification will be eternal. That's the depth of ignorance. The Jaimini philosophers further say that there never was a time when the world did not exist as it does today, which implies that there is no supreme controller who has created it. They claim that the arrangement of this world is real and appropriate, and thus is not illusory. Moreover, they say that there is no eternal knowledge of an original perpetual form of the soul. In fact, they say, knowledge arises not from some absolute truth, but from the differences among material objects. Knowledge, therefore, is not eternal and is subject to change. The assumption hidden in this statement is that there is no spirit soul who possesses eternal constant knowledge of a single unchanging reality. Rather, the nature of consciousness or knowledge is that it undergoes constant transformation. They state, however, that eternality is not refuted by the perpetually transforming nature of consciousness. Consciousness perpetually exists, they say, but not in the same form. Thus, the followers of Jaimini conclude that the transformation of knowledge does not negate its eternality. Rather, they state that knowledge eternally exists within the perpetual state of its transformation. Cool. They therefore naturally come to the path of regulated sense gratification rather than the path of renunciation. For in the state of mukti or liberation, the living entity would not have any material senses, and thus the transformation of material understanding would not be possible. Such philosophers consider that the achievement of an unchanging state of mukti would stunt or paralyze the natural activity of the living entity, and thus would not be in his self-interest. The path of nivritti, aiming toward renunciation and transcendence of the material world, is naturally not interesting to such materialistic philosophers. Accepting for argument's sake the validity of such materialistic philosophy, one can easily demonstrate that the path of regulated sense gratification brings many unwanted and miserable results to the living entity. Just go to the nearest Social Security Administration office and you'll see it in living color, 3D. Therefore, even from a materialistic viewpoint, detachment is desirable. Material time is divided into different sections, such as days, weeks, months, and years. And by material time, the living entity is repeatedly forced to undergo the miseries of birth, death, old age, and disease. That such real miseries occur everywhere throughout the universe is well known. In this way, states Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Lord Krishna has pointed out the defects of materialistic philosophy to Uddhava. So we hear that, don't we, when we're preaching? We hear, well, birth is just part of life. I mean, why are you so upset about it? Or why? Right? They just accept it all as a part of, nothing wrong with it. That's reality. They can't understand it. There's a reality beyond death, beyond birth and death. We may further elaborate that if one falsely accepts the atheistic philosophy of Jaimini and his innumerable modern followers, then the living entity perpetually remains entangled in the anguish of birth, death, old age, and disease. This bogus atheistic philosophy encourages material gratification as the only logical goal of life. But the living entity will inevitably commit mistakes in the execution of regulated sense gratification and eventually go to hell. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna, personally tells Uddhava that this materialistic philosophy is false and irrelevant to the actual self-interest of the living entity. Text 17. Although the performer of fruitive activities desires perpetual happiness, it is clearly observed that materialistic workers are often unhappy and only occasionally satisfied, thus proving that they are not independent or in control of their destiny. Hare Krishna Maharaj. I'll do that one again. Although the performer of fruitive activities desires perpetual happiness, it is clearly observed that materialistic workers are often unhappy and only occasionally satisfied, thus proving that they are not independent or in control of their destiny. When a person is always under the superior control of another, how can he expect any valuable results from his own fruitive actions? Purport. Although materialistic persons reject Krishna consciousness and instead pursue temporary sense gratification, even that sense gratification is often beyond their reach. If a person could really control his destiny, why would he create problems for himself? No intelligent person would impose death, old age, or disease upon himself or his loved ones. One should recognize that these unwanted miseries are forced upon one by a higher power. Since we are all, obviously, under superior control, the atheistic philosophy advising one to simply perform activities and create a happy life is most imperfect. Due to the influence of time, happiness and misery are created. When a woman becomes pregnant, her husband, relatives, and friends eagerly await the birth of the child. As time passes and the child is born, everyone feels great happiness, but as the child grows into old age and eventually dies, that same passage of time is cause of suffering. Ignorant persons vainly seek help from scientists who work feverishly and fruitlessly in their laboratories to stop death. In modern times, inventions have been created to eliminate the inconveniences of life, but the maintenance and production of such conveniences has proven to be unbearably inconvenient for hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. Just go down to the Social Security Administration office and you'll see it live and in color 3D. 70 millimeters? Only the most foolish person will propose that there is no superior controller and that one can achieve favorable results by expert performance of material activities. Ultimately, all material activities are useless because they end in annihilation. If one is driving a car but has only limited control, the situation is most dangerous and must lead inevitably to disaster. Similarly, although we are trying to direct the material body to happiness, we are not in full control of the bodily demands, and therefore there will inevitably be disaster. As stated in the Bhagavad Gita 9.3, Ashadadana Purusha Dharmasyasya Parantapa Aprapyamam Nivartante Mrityu Sangsara Vartmani. Those who are not faithful on the path of devotional service cannot attain me, O conqueror of foes, but return to birth and death in this material world. If one is not a devotee of Lord Krishna, the eventual result of his activities is simply mrityu samsara, repeated birth and death. I mean, Krishna is really trying to convince us here. Okay. It is observed within the material world that sometimes even an intelligent person is not happy. Shall I repeat that? It is observed within the material world that sometimes even an intelligent person is not happy. Similarly, sometimes even a great fool is happy. You can also, by extension, say that a person is very wealthy is unhappy sometimes. The concept of becoming happy through expertly performing material activities is simply a useless exhibition of false egotism. Purport. It may be argued that an intelligent person can expertly perform pious activities within the material world and thus never experience suffering, since unhappiness is caused by sinful or impious activities. However, we often observe great suffering even among pious, intelligent persons, because they sometimes fail in the execution of their duty and sometimes consciously or unconsciously perform a forbidden activity. With this argument, the Lord refutes the theory that simply on the strength of material piety one may remain perpetually happy without Krishna consciousness. On the other hand, we observe that even the most foolish or sinful persons sometimes experience happiness, because even those completely dedicated to sin sometimes accidentally perform pious activities by inadvertently traveling through a holy place or helping a saintly person. The material creation of God is so complex and bewildering that even those dedicated to piety sometimes commit sins, and even those dedicated to sinful life sometimes perform pious actions. Therefore, within the material world, we do not find absolute happiness or unhappiness. Rather, every conditioned soul is hovering in confusion without perfect knowledge. Piety and sin are relative material ideas that bestow relative happiness and unhappiness. Absolute happiness is experienced on the spiritual platform in full Krishna consciousness or love of God. Thus, material life is always ambiguous and relative, whereas Krishna consciousness is the actual platform of perfect happiness. Text 19. Even if people know how to achieve happiness and avoid unhappiness, they still do not know the process by which death will not be able to exert its power over them. Purport. If the so-called intelligent materialists know the means of achieving happiness and destroying unhappiness, then they should deliver people from inevitable death. The scientists are busily working to solve this problem, but since they have completely failed, it is understood that they are not actually intelligent and that they do not know the means of achieving happiness and eliminating misery. It is most foolish to think that one can be happy with an axe hanging over one's neck. Prabhupada used to give the example. He said, so here's a nice, beautiful, room, opulent with all the accoutrements, and here's a beautiful woman, and you can have free light, and she'll be very, very cooperative, she'll do whatever you want. And then as soon as you come out of the room, I'll beat you to death. That's the condition, that you can have that. Would anybody agree? No. And that's what's happening to everybody. Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Mrityu sarvaharas chaham. I myself come before you as death and take everything away. We should not blindly ignore the disaster of material life, but should instead accept the Lord's causeless mercy, which He so magnanimously offers in His incarnation as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. We should surrender to the lotus feet of Lord Chaitanya, who offers the real means for achieving unqualified happiness, the chanting of the holy names of the Lord. Hare Krishna. This is the Lord's desire, and it is in our own self-interest to take up this process. And we'll stop there for today. Hare Krishna. Okay, it's time for the philosophers to come out of the very philosophical reading tonight. Exercise our intelligence. Yes, Prana. Start us off, please.
In text 17, Krishna says that it's clearly, although the fruitive workers desire perpetual happiness by fruitive activity, it's clearly observed that they're often unhappy and only occasionally satisfied, proving that they're not independent or in control of their own destiny. And I thought that came to me as a relief, because it's like a constant battle to always try to achieve success and happiness through the material fruitive activities, something that I can do materially to make me happy, but it never works out, and thus so many people are frustrated over and over and over again. And it seems like the world's getting more and more frustrated, but they don't have the right fund of knowledge. They don't know where to turn. Material life is so bad, so that the intoxication and so many really degraded activities, which is just making it worse. But it came to me as quite a relief to just hear that, I'm not the controller. So the fact that I'm not experiencing, the ideal material circumstances at every moment, it just kind of made me feel like the surrendering process is really the source of that peace.
Makes you more inclined to take to the actual process. I was thinking of when I read that, I was thinking, Brahma, you can become Brahma, the controller of a whole universe, if you just do 100 lifetimes without making one mistake. Pious activity for 100 lifetimes without mistake. Then you get to be Lord Brahma. And then what happens? While you're creating the universe, a demon chases you, or the very people you're trying to take care of chases you and want to eat you or have sex with you or some crazy thing. And it's all there in the Bhagavatam, just laid out, So even if that were true, it can't be true. Of course, there again, the point keeps being made, although there was more talk about the Purva Paksha in this section than the actual reality. So, but it's there in the Bhagavatam, the actual arguments to these so-called philosophies that end up making one oblivious to spiritual life, covered completely with spiritual life. Especially the Buddhist philosophy, because they have this thing where everything is just flux. Everything's in flux, and it's eternal, and there's nothing but it, and there's no soul, but this form, when it goes away, it comes up in a form of energy, in another form. That's basically what it was saying, what the Prabhupada was saying. What a idiotic philosophy. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought Krishna's reasoning was really perfect. Of course it was, but it was just really brilliant. How he said even how it's impossible actually to do that. It's impossible to perform perfect pious activity, and because there's always that chance that you'll make some unconscious or
conscious or unconscious,
sinful activities. So you can never attain perfect happiness. And then he said the next verse, even if you could, you still can't free yourself from birth, death, and old age.
And that's when I thought of Brahma. It's exactly the point. And he gets a lifetime of what? 311 trillion years. And then he has to die.
The axe hanging over one's neck.
Yes. Yeah, that was great. In other words, the evidence is so clear. It's just if we don't have knowledge, we can't evaluate the evidence and come to the right conclusion. And that's why it's very important for us as neophyte devotees, because who's not a neophyte devotee? You know, or at least we should consider ourselves a neophyte devotees, even if we're not. We have to know this philosophy, and the more we explain it, and the more we hear it, and the more we explain it, Prabhupada said a number of times, hearing and explaining is more important than reading. That's why I got this idea to read out loud like this. The other day, I was listening, Prabhupada was in New Vrindavan, you know, and he was having like a garden conversation with a bunch of devotees, and he just had them read from his books. It was amazing. They were just reading from his books, and he was listening, and you could tell he was relishing. And then every once in a while, some point would come up that Prabhupada would, you know, and he would say something, and then the devotees would ask a question back and forth. Then he'd go back to the reading. I was in ecstasy. I think that's what we're doing every day. So nice. Yes.
Hare Krishna. I really like text 13, and the purport as well was nice. By submissively hearing from an expert spiritual master, the expert disciple develops pure knowledge, which repels the onslaught of material illusion arising from the three modes of material nature. Finally, this pure knowledge itself ceases, just as fire ceases when the stock of fuel has been consumed.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting that the pure knowledge even ceases when you're transferred into the transcendental platform. I don't actually understand that completely, so.
Would you care to inquire why you don't understand it? It seems to have grasped your imagination. Are you thinking that you'd like to have the pure knowledge dissolve?
Yes.
Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Acha.
Hare Krishna.
Well, these are the kinds of things that should come out and must come out in order to actually know the difference between, you know, real knowledge and, you know, philosophical understanding. Let's discuss this. This is a very interesting point. Prana, let's discuss it. Go ahead, you start.
Well, the living entity is qualitatively equal with Krishna, so Sat Chetanananda, so eternal cognizance. And so that the living entity is actually full of knowledge, so that never ceases. But the knowledge how to get out of the material world, like Gyan basically, the knowledge between matter and spirit, kind of like this analytical Sankhya, is put aside when one enters into the higher stages of realizing their spiritual form and whatnot. Like the living entities in the spiritual world aren't necessarily involved in like you know the yogis on Tapaloka, you know, engaging in great philosophical and
yeah, they don't have to understand the way it works and therefore ignore it or avoid it, you know, because yes, they automatically love Krishna. They know what to do automatically, and everything's provided for them also automatically. They don't have to struggle. But I'm wondering if that statement is in the Purva Paksha section, or is it in one of the answers? Should we get back to it? Let's get back to it. And analyze whether that's in a Purva Paksha section.
Right,
yeah. Or if it's actually the answer to the Purva Paksha.
what verse is it?
It's text 13.
That's before Krishna. That's the last verse of Krishna's explanation about the fire and the wood, and that knowledge. I guess he was explaining about how the fire is like the spirit soul, and the wood is like the material body, and seeing the difference between them. And he kind of analyzed that a little bit. And then that's the last verse in that section. Then he says, Uddhava, I have now explained perfect knowledge to you in text 14, but there's philosophers who reject this, like Jaimini.
Yes.
So it's before that section where he starts
So
presenting.
it is Krishna's explanation of the reality of life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it answers the question of how it is that knowledge of immaterial existence isn't eternal.
Mm-hmm. And also I was thinking how it's
That
not...
there is an eternal spirit soul,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is eternal knowledge that doesn't change.
I was thinking how it also doesn't go far enough necessarily just to know the difference between matter and spirit. The
Yes,
difference between
that's
soul and the
important.
body.
That's important.
That even that has to be sacrificed to the devotional service, to the bhakti process. Meaning that's not the goal, that's not the ultimate goal.
Yes.
If one attains that platform, it's not necessarily Bhagavan realization. It seems that's
It's
what
not
it is.
devotional. It's not pure devotional
Yeah.
service.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's almost like Bahunam Janmanam Ante
Right,
Jnana
Jnana
Padite. Like one who's in knowledge, the
Or let's
Jnanavan.
let's go to that verse in the 12th chapter, right? Where Krishna says it's just before Kleshodikatadastesham. Remember?
3 and 4.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. But those who fully worship the unmanifested, that which lies beyond the perception of the senses, the all-pervading, inconceivable, unchanging, fixed and immovable, the impersonal conception of the absolute truth, by controlling the various senses and being equally disposed to everyone, such persons, engaged in the welfare of all, at last achieve me. So you can get there by that way, but then, at what cost? Kleshodikatadastesham, asakto yaktisejta. For those whose minds are attached to the unmanifested, impersonal feature of the Supreme, advancement is very troublesome. To make progress in that discipline is always difficult for those who are embodied. To try to understand the non-conceptual, undifferentiated, absolute knowledge while one's embodied causes trouble. And therefore we must come to the personal understanding before we can become Samahatma Sadurlabha, Vasudevam Sarvamiti, Samahatma Sadurlabha. I was thinking of another thing, that while these sections are very hard to, they don't inspire everybody. Someone who's not very intellectual or not very adept, they won't be able to understand it. Therefore, it's not always the absolute right thing to do to beat somebody over the head with philosophy to get them to come to Krishna. That's why our Universal Mother's around, because she brings people in and gets people chanting and gets people, taking really nice prasadam, We have to come to this stage eventually where we can understand the difference between matter and spirit and, remove ourselves from material conceptions. We have to come to that stage. But it's not possible for everybody to come to that stage immediately. That's my own Prabhupada. Yes.
I was thinking how it's also important to distinguish between the knowledge that Krishna is referring to here and the knowledge of bhakti and devotional service. Because
to make the distinction.
Yeah, the spiritual master is giving this knowledge, and how does it say it? It says that it's ultimately...
Finally, this pure knowledge itself ceases.
Yeah.
This fire ceases.
So, someone who hasn't maybe had the encyclopedic vision of Prabhupada's books and this knowledge, they might conclude impersonal understanding that, all this knowledge that I'm hearing from the spiritual master about how Krishna is the personality and the deity form, that has to be given up too. Of course, that would be.
Well, that's what we have to learn. That we can't give that up. That's not what we're talking about when it comes. That's the point I was making. That started it off in the beginning when he said, this pure knowledge it goes away, just like the source of the flames goes away the flame goes away when the combustible material goes away. Yeah, it's very important that we make that distinction. I'm reading the 7th chapter of the Adi Lila, and there Prabhupada dismantles the Mayavad philosophy. Like there's one 21-page purport in it, and it goes back and forth between the Purva Paksha or the Mayavad philosophy and the real philosophy. And unless you're adept, unless you're attentive, at least paying attention, you can get carried away with one argument, because the Mayavad philosophy is so intelligent and so tricky and so, it can bewilder almost anyone. Even, I think it may be in that chapter, I haven't come to it yet in this reading, but there's one chapter in which Lord Chaitanya condemns the Mayavad philosophy and says, even a Mahabhagavat devotee can fall down by hearing, even inadvertently, the Mayavad philosophy receptively or submissively. That's why we have to be so careful. That's why when we went to the West in the beginning, Prabhupada was so careful to keep us protected, right? I remember the first few times I went to Vrindavan and Mayapur, I didn't even go out. I didn't go anywhere. I was just right there because he was so protected, because you start to go out and you hear so many things and see so many things that can easily confuse you what real devotional service is. That's why Bhaktivinoda Thakur, analyzes the Aprasampradayas. 13, I think there are Aprasampradayas, how to identify them and how to, defeat them. We're like little babies, So to mature, we have to grow up, get knowledge.
I like this Uddhava Gita a lot. It seems like chapter after chapter, it's getting better and better.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's a real summary of the whole thing.
How much Jaimini's philosophy is like this modern. The modern atheism is even worse because it doesn't accept any universal laws of piety or impiety.
Yes.
But it's basically the same exact thing, essentially.
Well, to make things more complicated, there are laws in Jaimini's teachings that help us to understand different. I heard Gopi analyze this. Maybe I can say something that might throw some light on what you just said. For instance, in the Sanskrit texts, sometimes there's different ways, and these ways are given by Jaimini, of determining what's the actual meaning or the actual purpose or the most important point being made in a sentence or a paragraph or even in a literature. And then they have rules, like if a point's made in the beginning, it's important, and that's one indication. If it's made in the beginning and the end, it's even more of an indication. And if it's made throughout, then you can be sure that's the main point. And especially when you're talking these kinds of sections, where it's going back and forth between Purva Paksha and reality, you have to have those. So sometimes, even Vaishnava philosophers, even Jiva Goswami will use those principles to prove, what's the what's the name of that? the verse there's one verse that the whole literature is built on. In the Bhagavatam, it's Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. Purva, it's called, what's the word?
Oh, not the Mahavakya.
No, not Mahavakya. I can't remember the Sanskrit word. Anyway, it's the one essence sense idea that the whole thing is built on. Ravindra Swarup made a really brilliant presentation about this and glorifying Prabhupada about how he took this, Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam and translated into pure Krishna consciousness, sussed out that there was I think it's coming from Jiva Goswami. Anyway, Hare Krishna. Stimulating. This is meant to stimulate our intelligence and our curiosity and to make us want to know and want to become safe. But even if we're not philosophers, if we keep hearing the truth from real authority, from the line of Srila Prabhupada in real authority, then we will become fixed. Even if we're not philosophers and can't figure all these things out for ourselves. Anyway, I think I'll stop now at 7:30. And thanks everyone again and again and again. This is very deep philosophical stuff. Try to understand. Just like when we chant Hare Krishna, we have to try to avoid offenses. And just by the art of trying, by the effort of trying, then we will get everything. So just keep trying to understand. And that was the point that was being made about the sincere disciple and sincere guru. Then it's like, what is it that the sticks, when they rub, because they make a fire not with a jet match. They make it by rubbing the arni wood. The arni wood is, there's one in the bottom and then one at the top, and they rub it in the middle. There's another, and then a flame comes. So this stuff may seem dry compared to the pastimes. That's why in the beginning of Bhagavatam, beginning of Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's all those heavy philosophical, like devotees sometimes they don't get through it. They don't get through to the nectarian pastimes of loving exchanges of Lord Chaitanya and his eternal associates. But in order to get there, you have to understand. You have to understand what's right and what's wrong. Okay, thank you very much. Srimad-Bhagavatam ki jai, Uddhava Gita ki jai, Sri Krishna ki jai, Sri Uddhava ki jai. Gaur Premanandi, Hari Hari Bol. See you tomorrow night, 6 o'clock, same time, same station. Hare Krishna.